Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting on the situation in Ethiopia, a matter that is increasingly preoccupying the African continent and the wider international community. A military confrontation, which started some 10 months ago in the northern region of Tigray, is spreading, and the level of human suffering is growing, with serious political, economic, and humanitarian implications for Ethiopia and the broader region. All parties must recognize a simple truth: there is no military solution. Last week, I issued an appeal for action on 3 fronts. First, calling on all parties to immediately cease hostilities. Second, ensuring a commitment for unrestricted humanitarian access everywhere and fully reestablishing of public services. Third, creating the conditions for the start of an Ethiopian-led political dialogue to find a solution to this crisis. These steps are essential for 2 critical reasons. First, the unity of Ethiopia and the stability of the region are at stake, and they are very important. The military front lines in Tigray have now reached the regions of Amhara and Afar. The declaration of a unilateral ceasefire by the government of Ethiopia on the 28th of June and the withdrawal of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces from Mekelle did not lead to a comprehensive ceasefire. The Tigray region remains largely under a de facto humanitarian blockade and cut off from key public services such as electricity and communications. Tigrayan forces have since expanded their presence into neighboring Amhara and Afar regions, where fighting has escalated. Other actors in Ethiopia have entered the fight through mass mobilization and the activation of regional armed groups. Inflammatory rhetoric and ethnic profiling are tearing apart the social fabric of the country. The wider region is already witnessing the political, economic, and social impact of the conflict beyond the borders of Ethiopia. Second, the human price of this war is mounting by the day. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. More than 2 million people have been displaced from their homes, and 1 million more are in immediate need of life-saving humanitarian assistance, including food, water, shelter, and health care. At least 400,000 people are living in famine-like conditions. Last month, UNICEF warned that 100,000 children face life-threatening severe acute malnutrition over the next 12 months. Refugee camps have been destroyed. Healthcare systems have been decimated, with hospitals and clinics attacked and looted. And this has all been exacerbated by electricity and communications blackouts. I'm also deeply concerned by reports of horrific sexual and gender-based violence from survivors, including women and children. I condemn these atrocity acts in the strongest possible terms. This is compounded by other serious allegations of human rights violations and abuses against civilians reportedly perpetrated by all parties to the conflict. There must be accountability. A joint investigation by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is concluding. Mr. President, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners have mobilized to reach more than 5 million people with food or other essentials. But the capacity to respond is severely constrained by insecurity, delays, and a host of restrictions on the work of humanitarian organizations. Overland access into Tigray now depends on a single route through the Afar region, which involves passing through numerous checkpoints. Humanitarian organizations require roughly 100 trucks worth of assistance and supplies to reach Mekelle every day. Yes, since mid-July, an average of less than 10 trucks per day have been able to get through, and no trucks have arrived for over a week, while food warehouses are now empty. Sadly, humanitarian workers have been harassed and even killed. Well beyond Tigray, the conflict in Afar and Amhara regions has displaced.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Ron Daniels. I'm president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century and convener of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue. And we welcome you to this crucial discussion on the growing crises in Ethiopia, exploring pathways to justice, peace, and reconciliation in this week in which the United Nations has discussed the whole idea of temperance and tolerance on the global scene. The Pan-African Unity Dialogue is an organization which is committed to having operational unity among Continental Africans, Afro-Latinos, Caribbean Americans, and African Americans. We believe that we must practice Pan-Africanism in the diaspora by working together with each other to resolve problems and issues. We have within the Pan-African Unity Dialogue a Crisis in Africa Task Force. That task force has looked at issues like the misbehavior of the destabilizer-in-chief, Museveni, in Uganda. Most recently, looking at the issue of the dissent of people like Bobby Wine and supporting the efforts of the opposition there. Having looked at Sudan and supporting the pro-democracy movement in the Sudan. Having examined the question of slavery in Libya, the enslavement of Africans in Libya. And most recently, we have been alarmed by the growing crisis here in Ethiopia. Our concern is about the horrific loss of life, the carnage that is taking place. And we know that there are different sides of this issue. We know that there are political differences. There are tensions that arise. A part of what we're concerned about is we as Pan-Africanists, as African people, how do we resolve our conflicts? And we believe that irrespective to who is responsible, that we must move to have African solutions, and those African solutions should be rooted in the notion of ma'at, of balance, of justice, of righteousness, and that we should not be sort of blasé about the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people who are suffering, who are being massacred, who are being raped, irrespective to who is responsible for these catastrophes. And so that is a major concern that we have, is that we as African people set an example to ourselves, that we will not be massacring our own people. As we relate this to this specific crisis, our concern arises out of what we initially saw emerging in Tigray province. A lot of the images were coming from Tigray because that's where we saw the preponderance based on the United Nations, CNN, and other networks in terms of what was unfolding. We have most recently also noticed there are catastrophes that are occurring outside of Tigray province. And we take note of those who have sent us notes and notes that I've studied about some of the catastrophes that are happening in other places. Well, we say that it doesn't matter whether the rape occurred in Tigray or the rape occurred outside of Tigray. We are opposed to rape. We're opposed to violence. We're opposed to the pillage that is taking place. And we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. Again, as Pan-Africanists, we want to be able to explore this crisis and all of its complexities, and it is complex. It is not simple. And we have assembled people whom we believe to be credible. Now, there's some who are saying, well, if they're from Tigray, they cannot be credible, or if they're from Ethiopia, they cannot be credible. We in the Pan-African Unity Dialogue are proud of the people we have assembled, and we believe that they are credible voices. And there are other voices that we're willing to hear, and some of them have already issued their opinions, and we are likely to hear from them down the road a piece. And we're open to that possibility. But most importantly, again, we say we are advocating the cessation of hostilities. And nothing that we say is in any way intended to dissolve the state. We're not advocating that Ethiopia dissolve itself, that it not become a nation. There is, however, a question about perhaps the nature of the state. And this may well be a part of the complexity and the nuance that we need to understand. That there may well be a debate about what is the nature of that state, particularly within a context where you have many ethnicities, many cultures, and many religions who are involved. Now, we also know that in these contexts, there's always the mischief and machinations of the United States and other imperial powers. We're aware of that. Therefore, we are not in favor of sanctions being imposed in this situation. And we are opposed to any machinations on the part of the imperialist powers who would like to take advantage of the internal differences that we have in order to advance their own interests. We are for African solutions to African problems. And we think that we have the history and background to achieve that objective. So having said that, I'd like to now turn to Don Rojas, who to begin our conversation today with a discussion briefly on the significance of Ethiopia, because it has great significance historically to the Black world. Don Rojas is the Director of Communications and International Relations for the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, also known as the Press Secretary for Maurice Bishop, the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada. He is indeed a legendary figure. I yield the floor now to Don Rojas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniels. Greetings, sisters and brothers. Good afternoon. My task today is to provide some historical, geographical, and demographical context and perspective as a framework for our discussions in this webinar, which will be focused on the tragic crisis in Ethiopia and why it should concern us all. Ethiopia is one of the most unique and consequential countries on the African continent, a country and a civilization of biblical proportions, a country that is revered by Pan-Africanists around the globe. Indeed, a country with one of the oldest civilizations in all of human history. On this occasion, many of us remember the iconic song War by reggae superstar Bob Marley, who became a Rastafarian in his adult years. The actual lyrics of War is the actual address by the late Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie to the League of Nations in 1935. At that time, Selassie was talking about war against the forces of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who had invaded and occupied Ethiopia in the early 1930s. This complex, multi-ethnic and multicultural society is considered the spiritual home for the Rastafarian community in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, and indeed across the world. Rastafarians from around the world have been settling in Ethiopia for the last 50 years, after being given land by Emperor Haile Selassie after World War II. Selassie granted 200 hectares of land to descendants of enslaved Africans who wished to find a home on the continent. The Christian Bible tells the story of the three kings who set out on a journey, guided by a star, to bring gifts to the baby Jesus in his birthplace of Bethlehem. One of those three kings was said to have come from Abyssinia, the ancient home for today's Ethiopia, the ancient name for today's Ethiopia. The Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia is a landlocked country in the Horn of Africa. It shares borders with Eritrea and Djibouti to the north, Somalia to the east, Kenya to the south, South Sudan to the west, and Sudan to the northwest. Ethiopia today has a population of some 117 million inhabitants and is the 12th most populous country in the world and the second most populous country in Africa. The national capital and largest city, Addis Ababa, with a population of some 5 million souls, is where the African Union has its headquarters. As noted before, Ethiopia is a multi-ethnic state with 80 different ethnic groups and dozens of different dialects. Christianity is the largest religion, followed by Islam. This sovereign state is a founding member of the United Nations, the Group of 24, the Non-Aligned Movement, the G77, and the Organization of African Unity, known today as the African Union. Addis Ababa is not only the headquarters for the African Union, but also for the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Standby Force, and many of the global NGOs focused on Africa. Ethiopian national identity is grounded in the long history of Christianity and Islam in the region and independence from foreign rule since antiquity. Some of the oldest skeletal evidence for anatomically modern humans has been found in Ethiopia, and it is widely considered as the region from which modern humans first set out for the Middle East and places beyond. In the 4th century, the Ethiopian Empire was one of the first in the world to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. While no longer distinguished as a state religion, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church remains the majority Christian denomination. There is also a substantial Muslim demographic, representing around a third of the population. In fact, a town in the Tigray region, Negash, is the oldest Muslim settlement in the entire continent of Africa. Tracing its roots to the 2nd millennium BC, the governmental system of Ethiopia was a monarchy for most of its history, Oral literature tells us that the monarchy was founded by the Solomonic dynasty from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba under its first king, Menelik I. During the late 19th century's scramble for Africa, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two nations that largely preserved their sovereignty throughout the colonization efforts by the European colonial powers. Many newly independent African nations adopted Ethiopia's flag, the colors of Ethiopia's flag, of green, gold, and red. Today, modern Ethiopia is gripped in a horrendous civil war, which has resulted in an enormous humanitarian disaster. Thousands have been killed and hundreds of thousands have been displaced. Millions face starvation. This is a tragedy with serious implications for the entire continent of Africa and for people of African descent around the world. And for those compelling reasons, we feel we have a duty and a responsibility to present this webinar today. In recent days, we've been seeing reports of the US government's concern for the crisis in Ethiopia and of Washington's plans to impose sanctions on the conflicting parties. We in the Institute of the Black World 21st Century hold to the Pan-Africanist principle that African crises require African solutions. Hence, we reject the threat of sanctions by the United States on the warring parties in the Ethiopian conflict, and we also condemn the interference by other non-African nations in Ethiopia's domestic affairs. We call on the African Union and on the United Nations to play a more robust role in pursuing an immediate ceasefire in the conflict and in facilitating a process of peaceful negotiations involving all parties. We applaud the recent mediation efforts by former Nigeria President Obasanjo and other African leaders, and we call on other elder statesmen in the Pan-African world to assist in these efforts. And we reject, as Dr. Daniels just said, we reject Washington's use of the crisis in Ethiopia as a pretext to bolster its military presence in Kenya, Djibouti, and other countries in the Horn of Africa. Our main goal is to appeal to all sides to stop the killing and the carnage and to use peaceful means to achieve a mutually agreeable and just settlement. The enormous human suffering is simply unacceptable, and the potential for serious instability in the Horn region of Africa is too dangerous a prospect. So sisters and brothers, stay tuned for a stimulating and enlightening discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don Rojas. And now we'd like to turn to the distinguished chairman of the United Africa Congress, and we say that with great pleasure. He is also a medical doctor, and he is a son of Ethiopia. And we have, and the United Africa Congress is a foundational member of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue. And we have learned a great deal from him, and we appreciate so much the support of the United Africa Congress. But we have been impressed with his analysis, but the pain that we have seen in his face and in his heart as he has seen this crisis unfold in Ethiopia. So we now present to look at some of the factors and some of the history from his perspective, Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein, the chairman of the United Africa Congress. You have the floor. You're muted, Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Nurhussein.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Daniel. Thank you also, IBW and Pan-African Unity Dialogue, for holding this important and timely forum on the growing crisis in Ethiopia. Let me say at the outset that this is a war that need not have been fought. Suffice it to say that the issues between the two parties were political and ideological in nature and could have been resolved through dialogue. I'll try to explore this further. Ethiopia, as Don alluded to, is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith country of 119 million, according to World Population Review, the latest, based on latest UN data. A brief review of Ethiopia's history over the last century and half is essential in shedding some light into the background of the current conflict in all its complexities. Ethiopia has been a monopoly of the ruling class of the Amhara nation. The emperors of the feudal empire claimed descent from King Menelik, son of King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, and therefore had a divine right to rule. The Solomonic dynasty started in 1270 after the collapse of the ancient Aksumite kingdom and the brief dynasty of the Agos. As the Ethiopian history professor Bahruzodeh noted, and I quote, "The creation of modern Ethiopia was started by Theodros, incorporated by Johannes, consolidated by Menelik, and completed by Haile Selassie," end of quote. Emperor Haile Selassie was the last of the long line of emperors of the Solomonic dynasty that was swept from power by a revolution in 1974. The imperial state was a highly centralized absolute monarchy, supported by the Orthodox Church and the landed aristocracy. The student movement of the 1960s and early 1970s called for the abolition of the archaic feudal system, distribution of land to the tiller, and the establishment of a people's democracy that would guarantee the rights of nations and nationalities to determine their own affairs. Amidst the chaos of the revolution of 1974, young officers and other ranks of the imperial army, sympathetic to the student demands, removed the emperor and established a military dictatorship, implementing most of the students' demands, but continuing the centralized system of governance. The Derg, as it came to be known under Colonel Mengistu, was Marxist-oriented, but excluded all other revolutionary forces who were calling for a civilian-led people's democracy. A brutal suppression of such forces unleashed what it called the Red Terror that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of revolutionary youth. Armed resistance to the regime began with Marxist groups such as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party and the regional Tigray People's Liberation Front, as well as the older Eritrean People's Liberation Front seeking independence from Ethiopia. TPLF and the EPLF alliance defeated Mengistu's mighty army in 1991. The new Ethiopian government immediately recognized Eritrea's independence. A coalition front consisting of TPLF, Amhara National Democratic Movement, Oromo People's Democratic Organization, and Southern People's Democratic Movement was formed and came to be known as EPRDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which ruled from 1991 to 2018. TPLF, which bore the brunt of the armed resistance to the previous military regime, sacrificing some 60,000 combatants, initially wielded a disproportionate share of the power within the coalition. In 1995, EPRDF promulgated a new constitution creating language-based federal system that recognized the multicultural nature of the country, creating autonomous regional administrative states with their own elected executive presidents and regional assemblies. The idea was to empower hitherto marginalized and aggrieved ethnic groups to govern themselves and have a say in how the federal government was run through their elected representatives to the House of Federation, the supreme legislative body of the federation. EPRDF promised democracy, introducing a parliamentary system of government under Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, for whom poverty reduction and eradication of famine was the immediate top priority to ensure food security, paying special attention to agricultural development and building infrastructure. Within a short period of time, agricultural production in Ethiopia quadrupled. The lives of the long-suffering peasants improved. Poverty rates declined from 45 to 23.5% by 2015, according to the World Bank and UNDP. The national economy took off, registering an unprecedented double-digit growth for over a decade before 2015. Significant strides were made in education and health. Ethiopia's infant and maternal mortality was reduced by half, achieving Millennium Development Goals 2 years ahead of schedule. Most importantly, the life expectancy of Ethiopians, which was 45 in 1991, increased to 66 plus by 2018. Our unity in our diversity was the guiding principle. Democratization process, however, did not keep pace with the economic development. Land, which was publicly owned since the revolution, was being leased to agro-businesses in several southern and eastern states, leaving some farmers displaced. Corruption in high places was becoming rampant, and income disparity was widening. Addis Ababa was growing rapidly and was to incorporate more of the surrounding Oromo farmland under a new master plan made public in 2015. This led to widespread protests in Oromia. The government retreated and scrapped the plan altogether. Protests continued, nevertheless, exposing deep-seated problems and long-standing grievances which were simmering below the surface. Violent protests erupted in Oromia and Amhara region. Scores of foreign-owned manufacturing plants in Oromia were destroyed. Declaration of state of emergency, while calming the situation, briefly led to further resentment and alienation. The EPRDF, after months of soul-searching and internal debate, replaced veteran leaders of the coalition parties with younger ones. Nowhere was this more evident than in Oromia, where two young dynamic duo, Lamma Magarsa and Abiy Ahmed, were elected president and vice president of the Oromia state, respectively. Prime Minister Desalegn Hailemariam abruptly resigned. After an intense and heated debate within EPRDF, Abiy Ahmed emerged as the new prime minister to head a caretaker government until the scheduled 2020 general elections. Within weeks of his assumption of leadership, he lifted the state of emergency, freed political prisoners, and closed down the notorious central prison in Addis Ababa. Abiy Ahmed invited opposition leaders and organizations abroad to come home and participate in the political process. Some of the coalition partners, including TPLF, felt that the prime minister designate was acting unilaterally without proper consultation. The disagreement between the TPLF and Mr. Abiy became increasingly rancorous. Mr. Abiy, in an attempt to smooth over differences, traveled to Tigray and addressed the leadership and the people in Tigrayan. Tigray represents the proud history of our country, he said. Tigray is an expression of who we are. Tigray is the root of our independence. Tigray sacrificed brave fighters to bring about change for justice and democracy, he added. He singled out for praise the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi for his visionary leadership. There is no Ethiopia without Tigray, he said. Ethiopia without Tigray is like a car without an engine. His message was widely and enthusiastically received. There was a palpable optimism and hope for a better future across the land. Perhaps his boldest move at the time was his unconditional acceptance of the Algiers Accord that ended the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea 20 years earlier. Foreign Policy magazine of July 12, 2018 was one of the rare publications, if not the only one, to see the peace move for what it was. They wrote, and I quote, Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki are racing towards peace because they both face the same threat. That is hardliners in the Tigray People's Liberation Front. End of quote. It turned out the so-called peace treaty was in fact a war pact. The Nobel Committee failed to see this and rewarded him with the coveted Peace Prize for what was a war preparation. The pressing issues that led to the unrest and eventual demise of the EPRDF were corruption, income inequality, lack of opportunity, and lack of justice, not ethnic tensions, at least not until the Prime Minister weaponized it soon after taking power, pointing fingers at TPLF as the sole responsible party for all the troubles, although the Oromo and Amhara parties and others of the coalition had a majority vote in the federal parliament. Abiy himself was a major official in the security apparatus of the EPRDF and held a cabinet post under the administration. His anti-Tigrayan rhetoric was accompanied by purging of Tigrayans from government offices, including the military, demonizing Tigrayans as daytime hyenas. Anti-Tigrayan sentiment spread throughout the country after the speech, particularly in Amhara and Oromo regions, where Tigrayan-owned businesses and homes were targeted and torched. Many Tigrayans were displaced, some fleeing back to Tigray. TPLF retreated to its home base. Many Amhara elites who never reconciled with the idea of a federal arrangement from the get-go were now blaming the federal system as a root cause, calling for reinstitution of the unitary government of old in the name of Ethiopianness and patriotism. The period March 1918 to November 2020 was marked by hostility and acrimony, with pro-Abiy media spewing messages of hate directed at TPLF and Tigrayans. Mr. Abiy began to dissolve the EPRDF and establish his own prosperity party. TPLF and OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, cried foul. He dismissed the duly elected presidents in various states and replaced them with his hand-picked loyalists who joined the Prosperity Party. TPLF did not comply, citing that Abiy did not have the mandate to do it. The Prime Minister postponed the general election, citing the COVID-19 pandemic as the reason. TPLF would not recognize a government that has not been elected and therefore considered it illegitimate. It conducted the elections in its region as scheduled over the objection of the Prime Minister. This resulted in further deterioration of relations. Profiling of Tigrayans in Addis Ababa and other major cities became routine. Meanwhile, Abiy and Isaias had multiple visits to each other's military installations and capabilities. Tigray's border with the neighboring Amhara state and Eritrea was effectively sealed, amounting to a blockade. On the eve of the outbreak of war, troops of Eritrea, Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Special Forces, and armed militia of the Amhara state were amassed at the border ready to launch a multi-pronged invasion. The Prime Minister called it a law enforcement operation to apprehend TPLF leadership. I will not go into the details of the war itself, which has been widely reported. Suffice it to say, foreign troops from Eritrea were invited to violate Ethiopia's sovereignty at the Tigray border and commit horrific atrocities against civilians, atrocities that amounted to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possible genocide. Furthermore, gender-based violence and withholding of food supplies were used as weapons of war. African leaders were alarmed. Calls for dialogue came from multiple sources, including Kagame and Kenyatta. Former President Obasanjo traveled to Addis, as did eminent persons comprising 5 former African presidents traveled to Addis Ababa. They were summarily dismissed. The civil war raged now, a year after it began, engulfing the adjoining states of Amhara and Afar. Tigray Defense Forces and the Oromo Liberation Army are now allied and marching on Addis Ababa. Hate speech by Abiy supporters has intensified. Tigrayans are, and I quote, Tigrayans are children of the junta, as the TPLF is referred to, who must be destroyed and eliminated, says one. The Prime Minister's senior advisor, a man of the cloth, Pastor Daniel, said at the public gathering, we must prevent people like them from ever being born. They must be the last of their kind, referring to Tigrayans. The US has issued an urgent message to its citizens to leave immediately, citing in its statement, and I quote, the security environment in Ethiopia remains very fluid. We are aware of reports of arbitrary arrests, detentions, and harassment of individuals based on their ethnicity in Ethiopia under the implementation of the government of Ethiopia's state of emergency. Tigrayans in major cities of Ethiopia are rounded up and thrown to jail. The whereabouts of some of them is unknown. Their business is shuttered. It has become a crime to play Tigrayan music in bars and cafes. So what are the factors contributing to the war? I would cite only one major factor, namely conflicting visions for the future of Ethiopia. The federalists who believe our diversity is our strength, and the advocates of unitary centralized government who say it would be the only way to ensure the unity of Ethiopia. All the other factors leading to the war emanate from this. These are issues that could have been and still need to be resolved through dialogue with the help of mediators, honest brokers, if needed, by well-wishers of Ethiopia. There is an abundance of wisdom among elders of Africa that need to be tapped into. How this is resolved or remains unresolved will have far-reaching reverberations in the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea Basin, and indeed in the continent of Africa and beyond. The optimist in me hopes that after all the bloodletting, a modern democratic republic of Ethiopia will be born, and that the current crisis represents the birth pangs of that nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein, for your presentation. You're being skewered as a tribalist and an apologist for the Tigrayans by many of our observers. I would hope that the final point that you made is one that will be focused on. And that is, what is the nature of the Ethiopian state and what is its future given the multi-ethnic, multi-religious character of Ethiopia? Again, the fact that people are maybe from a particular region is not something that we are advocating so much in terms of their perspective, but it is to look at the question of the complex, nuanced nature of this conflict. And by the way, as we said before, the initial reports that we examined as the Pan-African Unity Dialogue was a horrific carnage in Tigray itself that was being documented by the United Nations and other outlets, including human rights organizations who attested to these atrocities. And so therefore, this is what got our attention and got us to begin to delve in more deeply into the nature of the crisis. I reported earlier that we now see that the Tigrayan forces that they moved out, they themselves have also committed some atrocities, and we're opposed to the atrocities, period. But we're also interested in excavating and understanding the nature of the crisis and coming to a just solution as Don Rojas initially outlined in his presentation. It is in that context that we now invite Sister Millete, and I'm going to ask her to introduce herself. I'm not adept at the last names. She has a testimonial she'd like to present. She is an activist, but she's been engaged and involved and wants to share the experience, her experience in terms of her family. So you now have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels, and thank you for bringing us all together for this incredibly important conversation. My name is Millete Birhanemaskel, and I just want to correct, the pronunciation is Tigray. I'm from Tigray. Most of my family is in Tigray. There are a couple of things that I want to say. I appreciate the purpose of this panel, and I can assure you that no one was more Ethiopianist than Tigrayans up until this most recent genocide on the people of Tigray. And I have to say, there's no way for a Tigrayan to put the state before the people. So we're not here for the dismemberment or the dissolution or the breakup of Ethiopia. However, we cannot put a state before the people. And you would not either if it was your mother who was being raped or your brother who's being shot and thrown over a cliff. So I want to be very, very clear about that. And I already know the comments are going to be full. I'm used to it, especially after a year of she's paid by TPLF. She's an agent of TPLF. She works for them. They're there, to destroy Ethiopia. None of it is true. So let me just say that and put that out there. I also want to say there's a lot of talk about, Western influence and neo-colonialism and neoliberalism and all of that. Let me just tell you that the first person to liberalize the Ethiopian economy is Abiy Ahmed himself. He has sold literally every national, asset that was, listen, when I remember a decade ago or so trying to start a business or for some family in Ethiopia, and you could not even literally own land if you were not an Ethiopian, or you couldn't prove your heritage and your descendancy. That's how much the previous government, EPRDF, was anti-imperialism. Now, pretty much every national asset has been sold. to outsiders, including all of the mining rights in Tigray. And that's why you have countries like Canada who refuse to speak up about the genocide, because they were basically paid off to not say anything. So there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation about what is actually happening in Tigray and in Ethiopia. And it's important that we bring everyone to the table so you could hear, especially folks who are at the center of what's happening. So that's really important to me. Tribalism has been an issue in Ethiopia from its origin. And so to suggest that that's something new is also very false. Ethnic federalism was an answer to tribalism because various minority ethnic groups were being forced to sort of blend into one national identity. And it was erasure. It was an act of erasure on indigenous Africans. Just so you know, Haile Selassie himself owned slaves. The darker you were, the more likely you were to be a slave. So you can't, the history and the story about Ethiopia never being colonized isn't an honest one. Ask an Oromo what their opinion is about that. So we have to come to a truth and reconciliation moment about the truth of Ethiopia and how we got here and why every couple of decades there's a genocide on a group of people. And that's why Marcus Garvey, by the way, did not like and wrote about Haile Selassie, and it was because he owned slaves. So let me just tell you, because I want to recenter and bring this back to the people, because that's why we're here. So for over a year now, Tigray has been under siege. The story you'll hear is that Tigrayans attacked the base, but it was a failed coup on the leadership of Tigray. The constitution in Ethiopia allows each region to elect its own government. And then they are loosely governed by a federal government, by the federal government. This war is really a political conversation. It should have been a political conversation at a table. Do you want a strong central government or do you want a weak central government? A fair question, and one that comes up in any so-called democracy, I guess, around the world. But instead, what happened is that for the 2 years prior to the so-called base attack, there's been a low-grade aggression on the people of Tigray. The Ethiopian government denied them their budgetary allowances. There's a huge locust invasion in the northern part of Ethiopia, and everyone in the north was given their tools to fight locusts except Tigrayans. And it continued. That type of COVID came. Tigrayans were not given PPE to fight COVID. And so there's been this low-grade aggression. The roads have been blocked, so supplies can't get into the region. And then there was the so-called base attack. Even though preparations for that war had started at least 10 days prior, there were troop movements, and we knew that Eritreans were coming to the border in order to help the prime minister attack the people of Tigray. Since then, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of documented massacres on the people of Tigray. You have no services in all of Tigray. I mean, no running water, no electricity, no internet, no phones. We're in the middle of a pandemic and the people have no running water. No food is coming into the region. Eritrean soldiers came in and gang raped women, gang raped children. The youngest rape victim on record is 4 years old. Why do the people of Ethiopia allow their government to commit these crimes in their name? They should be outraged. They should be completely outraged. Even if the base attack actually happened, let's say it did happen, that is military on military. Why are the people having to pay the price for that? Collective punishment is illegal and immoral, and everyone should stand against that, regardless of who you are or where you are. I've lost 9 family members in the Tigray genocide, 9 in the first 6 months of this war. For the last 6 months, we have no contact with anyone. So we don't even know what's happening now. We know we get these weak reports about 200 children have died of starvation according to one hospital. Well, all of the hospitals have been destroyed in Tigray by Eritrean and Ethiopian and Amhara militias. There are no hospitals. You only have one that can give you any type of information. So if 200 are dying where you can get information, what do you think the death toll is in areas where you can't get information about what's happening? What's happening to the people of Tigray is a travesty of biblical proportions. Everyone should care. We should not be putting the state of Ethiopia above the people. Pan-Africanism is about Africans helping Africans, not about uplifting a state structure. Ethiopians in Ethiopia or in the diaspora try to use Black Lives Matter. BLM is a movement against state violence. The state of Ethiopia what Ethiopians are doing is supporting state violence. You cannot use BLM for that argument. It flies in the face of it. So this conversation is incredibly important. I'm glad that we're having it, but there's a lot of realities and a lot that we need to address. It is a genocide. That's not an exaggeration. If you look at the 10 steps of genocide, everything has happened from dehumanization to classification to discrimination. I don't have to tell you because you just got a great summary about what's happening to Tigrayans in the capital city of Addis Ababa. They're being rounded up and put in concentration camps. So stop blaming white people in the West for what Africans are doing. We are responsible for the carnage that is happening in Tigray. We have to deal with that. We have to address that. You can hate me if you want, but I'll tell you, if it was your mother who was being killed, your sister who was being raped, or your family who was being starved, I hope you would be as loud as I am. So thank you for this conversation. And by the way, you mentioned there's no Oromo representation here, but this whole movement, the whole movement of getting rid of EPRDF was Oromo youth who came out and protested. And now all of their leaders have been jailed. This is a fascist regime that claims to have been democratically elected when half of the country was in the middle of war and couldn't vote, or the other half only had one person on the ballot. So we have some serious issues as Africans to talk about. We must protect African people, not African states, arbitrary states that were created, by colonialism. Let's be real. And we have to deal with this. We have to come together. And I believe that we can as Africans, but we can't do it if we're going to ignore what's happening. The African Union had a whole campaign called Silence the Guns, while Abiy Ahmed was dropping bombs in Tigray, and we're afraid to bring up that conversation. So this is a powerful and brave conversation. I know the comments, people are going wild, and that's fine. I hope you care, because if you don't care, it means you're numb, and you shouldn't be numb. So I thank you. I look forward to being able to reach my family eventually. And there's a lot of criticism about the Tigray Defense Forces marching to Addis Ababa. And look, we've asked Abiy Ahmed over and over again, lift the siege. Turn the water on, turn the electricity on, turn the power on. The people are literally dying of starvation. Allow the food to come in. There's no food in Tigray because the Eritreans burned the farms. There's a long history of problems between the people of Tigray and Eritreans. We're brothers, we're sisters, by the way, but that's a conversation for a whole different day. Lift the siege. The reason TDF is marching to Addis Ababa is because that's where the problem is, in Arat Kilo. We're not talking about the people along the way. I'm not going to sit here and say that nothing has been done wrong along the way there, but we demand independent investigations in order to address all of those things. You can't have a person who's party to the conflict also do the investigations. That's unreal. So we hope for those investigations, and we hope that this regime will be toppled so that the people can eat. That's what we want, the survival of our families. And that's what we're fighting for. Nothing more, nothing less. So thank you for hearing me out.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for laying out that position. We'd now like to go to Dr. Mulugeta, who also would like to talk about the human toil. I guess one of the questions would be to raise questions of whether or not this data is true or not. That's one of the questions that has to be raised, because otherwise, this is really not having a mechanistic, what I would call a mechanistic analysis. The question of what is happening to the people does matter, and how we assess that is incredibly important. So as again, we were drawn to this because of the enormity of what appeared to be happening in Tigray. And so we'd now like to hear from Dr. Mulugeta and his perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you hear me very well. Yes, my name is Mulugeta Gerbregziabher, and I am professor. And I am not a TPLF agent, as some of the commentators say. So thank you, Dr. Daniels and the IBW for hosting this very important conversation. It would be hard to go after Millete, who very well presented actually some of the situations. And I will focus on the humanitarian and health crisis of the war on Tigray. And really important here is, as a Pan-Africanist myself, I would like to quote Martin Luther King: "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." The lives of people that are suffering in Tigray, as Millete was just describing, matters to me, matters to you. That's why we are speaking about this. So I have co-authors to mention here because this is actually real data, a real study submitted to reputable journals. And I have also my disclosure here. So the objective here is, one, I would like to demonstrate the humanitarian and health crisis of the war on Tigray. And I would like to illustrate using a case study, actually, a study that we did between November 20 and June 21. So it doesn't include data after June 21. And also maybe make an appeal to the international community to help stop the humanitarian and health crisis of the war on Tigray. So, I mean, like every one of us would understand, war, armed conflict destroys health facilities and displaces health workers. These are pictures from Tigray. And it has, of course, long-term and short-term devastating impact on population health, especially on the vulnerable populations like women, children, the disabled, and refugees. And with Tigray as a lens, we provide additional evidence to the ongoing calls and study to make war a priority public health or a priority health agenda. So as part of that effort, I have been studying this war and its impact on the humanitarian and the health aspect. Now, it was already described by Dr. Mohammed very well. The fighting, began on November 4, 2020. However, actually, the plans for the war predate November 2020. This has been disclosed recently by William Davidson on his blog or on his Twitter. Ethiopian troops, Eritrean troops, and Amhara militia and other foreign actors are fighting against the Tigray government led by the governing party TPLF. The war is characterized as genocidal with massacres, ethnic cleansing, weaponized rape, famine, displacement, ethnic profiling, and attacks. This is, from Amnesty International as well as Human Rights Watch reports. What are the headlines? If you see the news, over 90% of people in Ethiopia, Tigray, need emergency food. Ethiopia is deliberately starving its own citizens. The Economist, you have seen it on PBS NewsHour. And then CNN have also shown, this is not a picture from 1984. This is a picture from this recent war. Due to the blockade, due to the siege, and due to the humanitarian crisis that's going on. Even the scientific community has started to get into this. Dr. Walter Mikael from Norway has published recently Inventing Hell, how the Ethiopian Eritrean regimes produce famine in Tigray. So the famine we are talking about is actually a man-made famine. This is deliberately created by blockading Tigray from getting any humanitarian access. Well, so today, it's already more than 380 days since the war started. But like I said, this dashboard that I'm showing is on day 265. And what it shows you is, this is a dashboard that we have been putting together every day to, document and archive the data of what's happening in Tigray. So there is siege, there is blockade, there is destruction of infrastructure causing this starvation. There were murder of 3, Doctors Without Borders staff. More than a total of 21 humanitarian aid workers were killed. And then when it comes to the Tigray health workers, more than 37 are killed and 78 are injured, and more than 22 of them are displaced. Here are some of the pictures. You have a Dr. Tedros, who was really, a doctor in Humara, and now he is a refugee in the Sudan camp. So, if you look to this chart, actually, it gives you most of what Millete was trying to describe. It is really, really, a genocide unfolding, for almost a year in our eyes. But the world community, the international community, haven't really taken very concerted action to stop it. Now, I will go to my data now. Structure of the Tigray health care system before the war looked like this. It has 3-tier systems where you have tertiary care, secondary care, and primary care. And it was one of really the most advanced ones in the state of Ethiopia. And as you can see, even the numbers of facilities, health facilities we had, including tertiary care, all the way to health posts is given here. And in 2020, these numbers were like this. And I will show you what has happened to these health facilities, about, more than 1,000 of them in total. So this is the distribution by region. You have here some of the sub-regions of the Tigray states. And this was the statistic before the war. Now, as I said, this was collected until June 2021, and during an active civil war and with imposed communication blackout. But we have been able to verify this data by triangulating the information from 3 sources, including international and local organizations. And what we have here is data on health facility type, geocoding, that means longitude and latitude of this, the population size, and the health facility status, where based on criteria, this is standard criteria, whether they are fully functional, partially functional, not functional, or no communication, compared to their pre-November 2020 status. Now, our findings, I will show you the figures. There are only 13.5% of all hospitals and health centers, and none of the 712 health posts are fully functional. Only 3.6% of all health facilities are fully functional. That means, actually, the data shows that none of the health facilities are at their pre-war status level, because there is either electricity, water, or power, or something missing compared to what it was pre-war. About 64.6% of all hospitals and health centers, or 16.7% of all hospitals, health centers, and health posts are either not functional at all, or there is no communication due to occupation by invading forces like the Eritrean forces and the Amhara militia. Here is some of the data. This is, like I said, the geographic distribution by the zones, the different subparts of the state of Tigray. And as you can see, some of them are at about 2%, some of them are at about 4.8%. So there is variability in terms of, the health centers' functionality status. And, this is geocoded data as of June 2021. And you can see, really, almost all of the health facilities in Tigray are not operating at their pre-war status. Now, in conclusion, the war on Tigray has created a catastrophic crisis impacting millions and has clearly a direct and devastating impact on delivery of healthcare. And this study provides additional evidence to encourage the international community to work together to identify best practices to prevent war and promote support to the war-torn areas. Now, I think part of what I would like to speak here is a call for action. We can't stop just presenting data and stop there. I think people could actually participate by writing letters, by signing petitions, by even contributing to policy and statements by their representatives. I like another, Martin Luther King's call here. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. Actually, what you hear even in the chat, it's not only silence, but even denying, justifying what is going on in Tigray, which is, to some extent, very sad to see it from what we call, people, humans, our friends, our colleagues, up to this November 2020 war. Now, who should be involved? As Pan-Africanists, who should be involved? Civic organizations and professional organizations should be involved. They can advocate, really for the self-determination rights of people, because we are talking about a state, a country that is multi-ethnic, that is very diverse. You have the Oromo, who have been asking for self-determination for a long time. You have the Somali, you have the Afar, and so many other ethnic groups in that country who have been seeking the right for self-administration. And that needs to be, I think, the answer to the existing ideological divide that we have in the country. Because at the heart of this, at the heart of what is going on right now, is this tension between the visions Dr. Mohammed was really describing. That is, you have groups, federalist and confederalist groups, that are seeking self-determination rights for their people. And you have any Unitarian group. Even at times, the extremists would want one country, one religion, and they call it one vote. I think that is not going to be sustainable. That's not going to be helpful for the state of Ethiopia. Individuals could also be involved in this by demanding for unfettered access to humanitarian aid, by asking their representatives, political representatives, as well as by participating in advocacy. For instance, you can see that the American Statistical Association, the African Studies Association, and some other, including the World Federation of Public Health Association, have made statements condemning the destruction of educational as well as health facilities in Ethiopia. Why am I doing this? I mean, I have been, a researcher for a long time, a global health researcher for that, traveling between the US and Ethiopia, not only just to Tigray, but, Addis Ababa and also some of the Amhara regions. And I have had, workshops, capacity development workshops throughout the country. My last visit, yes, my last visit was, July 2019, where we were doing a workshop, a capacity development workshop with my chair, Dr. Vina. And, it's very sad. I mean, here, what made me really, really involved in this was the killing of one of the people who was a trainee in our program. You have my mom, who is 80 plus years old, who is stuck in that region. So I am concerned for my family. I am concerned for my colleagues. I am concerned broadly also. I have a global health project that is not operational right now because of the war. Finally, I would like to call everyone to participate in a global health international symposium that we are organizing in the winter. We will be talking about how to really help, make actually war as a public health crisis agenda, as a health crisis agenda, as a humanitarian crisis agenda, so that policymakers could actually help us with this. I would like to thank so many people, they are listed here, my co-authors, as well as my department, my university, and also, this Pan-African group that has allowed us to talk about this. My acknowledgement here, and thank you so much. I can stop here.
Thank you very much. Now we have to tighten the times up here. People are sort of blowing through their time limitations as we described them, because we wanted to permit time for questions and answers, and there will certainly be a lot of them based on what we're seeing. I do want to return to the fundamental question of the data in terms of the human toll and the catastrophe that we have seen unfolding in Tigray. Not so much because it is to advocate for their position, but it is at least as a baseline to ask whether or not we as Africans are willing to tolerate that, and are we willing to pursue our goals at any cost in relationship to the destruction of our people. And that's something that I, from my own ideological point of view, that I've increasingly talked about, because I see too many ideologues who blow past this. I mean, the human toll, the human catastrophe is irrelevant to the broader political point that's being made. And the political point I want to make is that we as African people must find ways to resolve our conflicts with each other in ways that do not result in the destruction of human beings at the level that we tolerate all the time as sophisticated political analysts. And so I have a kind of, a bias that is pretty strong in terms of that perspective. I'd like to now turn to Pierre Sane. He is a distinguished citizen of Senegal, and someone who we would like to talk about the regional and continental implications. This is a conflict which is not only consuming Ethiopia, and you can see the intensity of the, conflict, the personal venom that is being spewed and so forth, because families are involved and there's visions of the nation that are involved, and that's all good. We all want Ethiopia to become that leading nation that is spoken about in the Bible. In fact, the whole African continent in that regard. The question is, how do we do that? On what basis do we do that as African human beings relating to each other? So we'd now like to go to Pierre, who is the founder of Imagine Africa and the former Secretary General of Amnesty International. Pierre, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ron Davis. Thank you for inviting me to join all the eminent panelists. I think the urgency now is to stop the escalation, to stop the war. It seems that the TPLF is winning the war, but I hope they will not enter into Addis Ababa, because if they do that, we are going to confront a 20-year war in Ethiopia, and the whole East Africa, the whole of the Horn of Africa will be taken down by the following conflict. So it seems that there is a stalemate. That stalemate has to be consolidated, and talks, serious talks about a ceasefire without preconditions should be encouraged. And maybe IBW and the Black Caucus and maybe some political moral leaders in Africa could play a role by sending a small delegation, because the African Union is seen as siding on the side of the federal government, because that's what the African Union does, and that's what ECOWAS does. They always side with central government and call for restoration of the constitutional order, even when the constitutional order had been abused before by those who are in power. So I am not sure they will be seen as a sincere mediator. Other governments, be it the US, even Kenya, I am not sure that they will be able to achieve, to get the confidence on both sides that they could sit down, negotiate a serious ceasefire without preconditions. So maybe IBW, Black Caucus, with a couple of credible leaders in Africa, could go to Addis Ababa. This is civil society, African civil society, Pan-African civil society, concerned with the suffering of African people in Ethiopia, in Tigray, of course, and maybe they could talk sense to those elites on both sides. The elites have arrived at a point where now they are waging war on people. I don't have a problem with elites and their military apparatus fighting each other. I don't have a problem with war. I have a problem with attacks on the civilian. I have a problem with crimes against humanity. I have a problem with war crimes. Otherwise, I don't have a problem with war. I don't think the history of Africa, the coming history of Africa would be without wars. And I think we can anticipate many other wars in Africa. But what we have to make sure of is that we eliminate the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and that can only be done by giving more teeth to the International Criminal Court, because the International Criminal Court, by going after the criminals who commit mass crimes, will help in preventing further mass crimes. That is how you fight impunity, is by sanctioning the criminals individually. I think when you look at the war in Ethiopia, it is both unique and a general African problem. It is unique because Ethiopia is a unique country. It is an empire. It is a colonial power, and it has never been colonized before, contrary to all other African countries who have been colonized and are subject to the same forces of against central authoritarianism, and who are pushing for devolution, who are pushing for decentralization. Now, the main contradiction I can see now in Africa is a tension between the development model, which we are more and more copying on China. A development model which requires a strong state. A development models that requires authoritarianism. A development model that requires central allocation of resources, and a development model that push for a coming future, democracy, evolution, and the other one is the campaign for human rights, for democracy, for devolution. And the role of the World Bank is central here. If you look at the policies that the World Bank is pushing now in Africa, it's decentralization, it's devolution, because they think that a central, strong state could be a means to achieve development. And the mission of the World Bank is to prevent development in Africa. The mission of the World Bank is to prevent industrialization. The mission of the development is to keep Africa poor, because if Africa develops, then there is no need of the World Bank. And they think that by pushing decentralization, they push liberalism, because they will be confronted by a weak state. So you have this tension between the calls from the people for further devolution, further decentralization, further democracy, pushed by the World Bank. On the other hand, you have the central state, which looks at the success of China in terms of economic development, who realize that economic development in third world countries need a strong central state, but the elites at the regional level, at the central level, have been incapable of sitting together around a table to agree a formula that will allow both development and democracy. They are not incompatible.
That's right.
Now, instead of bringing all the elites so that they can merge into a melting pot, so that you don't have ethnic preeminence in terms of the elites, be it economic elites or political elites, they fall into the trap that only submission to the preeminence of one group will allow the central state to further its prospects of development, be it in the past with the Amhara aristocracy, or during Meles, during the authoritarian days of the TPLF. The incapacity of the African elites to compromise, to find a solution, to invent a model. We don't have to copy China, and we don't have to be like the West, but the people want freedom and food. They want economic development, but they want also devolution and participatory democracy. So it is a model that we have to invent. But the elites very often resort to use of force and violence. I mean, all of the wars in Africa is lack of dialogue, lack of compromise. They make it a zero-sum game. Controlling the state is I take everything and the others have nothing. And as long as we have not solved that, as long as we have not agreed how we conquer power, how we exercise power, how we share, and how we make sure that the priority is the people. Government is there to ensure the well-being of the people. So any election is a matter of political violence and etc. But what the people want, they want an improvement in their living condition, continuous improvement. They don't ask the government to park a Mercedes in front of their hut. They just want to have the basics to which they are entitled: food, water, education, health, participation in the democratic process. But the elites in Africa are at a stage of accumulation of capital, and they see it as a zero-sum game, which is I win, you lose, and they are ready to use violence. So that's why I'm saying also it is a general problem. You can see in Congo, in the DRC, with the eastern part of all the violence in the eastern part of the Congo, which is linked again to this failed regionalization, decentralization. In Sudan, which is what led to the secession of the South Sudan, Darfur, Somalia, for all, has split into 3 different states. Nigeria had its Biafra secession, and now there are calls again for a new Biafra secession. Decentralization is being, again, a central discussion in countries in transition, be it Chad or Mali, Guinea, or Cote d'Ivoire. But we will not be able to solve it unless we solve it peacefully. And we have everybody agree to make compromises. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre Sane. I was saying hallelujah, amen, throughout the course of your presentation. This is quite sobering in terms of dealing with complexity and nuance, as opposed to sheer, dare I say, ideological shibboleths. I mean, this is like dealing with the realities on the ground, the tensions that have to be dealt with. And among other things, what I would call the African Mayat principle, that we do not wage war on the people. We do not destroy the people in the interest of our ideological visions. That is outside of, it seems to me, what the African tradition should be. It is perhaps for some other Eurocentric ideological philosophers who care very little about, quite frankly, how the implementation of their vision comes to be. We should not be guilty of that. And so I appreciate you, Pierre Sane, for laying out really the complexities of the conversation, the nuance, the subtleties. And in my closing remarks, I think we will find some unity in terms of my observations of how certain systems do not work for African people. They don't work in Haiti. They don't work. There are certain systems that just don't work. We have to reinvent. We have to reimagine, or go back to imagining who we are as a people, and find the solutions within our own history and heritage in order to move forward in that regard. Now I'd like to turn to implications for the diaspora. We have a son, a proud son of Uganda, who is among us. He is a founding member of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue, and we're delighted that he is such. He is the editor and publisher of the Black Star News, and has a soon-to-be award-winning book out, which he can speak about. I now yield the floor to our comrade, Milton Allimadi.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Daniels. I'd like to start off by echoing what Pierre Sane said. I think indeed IBW is in a unique position to play a critical role leading toward a peace process I had actually been thinking about that too. And I think Pierre Sane can assist in identifying some prominent individuals on the African continent. But I sincerely hope that Professor Daniels, you can be a part of this process together with some prominent members of the Black Congressional Caucus. I think it's clear now that there's no military solution to any of the sides in this conflict. Any military so-called victory would be temporary and would only delay further conflict. Now, let me speak about the role of the diaspora. The African diaspora, first of all, and then within that African diaspora, the Ethiopian diaspora. When I talk about the African diaspora, of course, I'm talking about Africans from other parts of the continent, and I'm talking about African Americans, I'm talking about Caribbean sisters and brothers. Ethiopia, as has been pointed out by several speakers, including Brother Don Rojas, has always inspired Africans globally because of its long history of resistance against imperialism, European imperialism, going all the way to the Battle of Adwa, 1896, which was a great source of pride to Africans globally, that Ethiopians were able to come together, all the nationalities, and defeat this European power that wanted to colonize Ethiopia. And then, of course, as Don Rojas also pointed out, the fascist Mussolini invasion. That also inspired Africans globally, including Africans from the United States, the Caribbean, volunteering to go and fight against this aggression. And that is why Ethiopia has always had this played this special role to Pan-Africans globally. So once again, Pan-Africans are aggrieved by the current conflict in Ethiopia. And of course, there's division amongst Pan-Africans, with people that support the Abiy government and people that support the people of Tigrayan, saying that they're engaged in self-defense against an invasion that was launched by the central government and the neighboring country of Eritrea. So there's great division. At this moment, I would hope that the Ethiopian diaspora can actually rise to the occasion and lead us toward peace. They are one of the most powerful diasporas here in the United States. The numbers range from hundreds of thousands to perhaps up to 1 million Ethiopians in diaspora. They're well organized. They're responsible for remitting billions of dollars annually to the country. They have media networks that include online publications, include television stations. They're well organized in terms of lobbying. One of the most effective lobbying by Africans in Washington, D.C. Ethiopians are engaged in that. They know how to influence U.S. foreign policy. And that is why if they make the decision that their number one priority is a ceasefire, and then followed by negotiations for a permanent peace, that is something that would definitely occur. When they're on the same page, there's nothing that they've not been able to accomplish. When they were on the same page in getting rid of the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia, they rallied resources, mobilized resources and public opinion, and supported the effort to overthrow that dictatorship, and they succeeded. Most recently, they were on the same page in celebrating the reforms that Prime Minister Abiy had initially launched in Ethiopia. But now today, they are divided. they reflect the same division that are in Ethiopia due to this conflict, with those who are supporting the prime minister and those that are supporting the people of Tigrayan. But if they can see clearly that there's no military solution for this, then they should come to the conclusion that a ceasefire has to be their #1 priority. And they must make that demand. As Pierre Sane pointed out, it may be difficult to find neutral parties in the region for where the peace process can be initiated. We should not remove from the table the possibility of starting the negotiations right here in the United States, in Washington. After all, there's a very sizable community of Ethiopian diaspora in the Washington, Maryland, Virginia area. Why not start the peace process right here in the United States? And then eventually, if we can determine a neutral environment in an African country, that's where we can relocate the process and continue the process there. But we cannot afford to say we can't start the peace process because we can't find a neutral entity on the African continent. The suffering people on the ground cannot afford that luxury. So that is why, as a Pan-African, I urge my Ethiopian sisters and brothers, I plead with my Ethiopian sisters and brothers, please come to the conclusion that the #1 priority today is an immediate ceasefire. With your well-organized communities here in the United States, if you make that your #1 demand to the United States government, I don't see that you could fail in accomplishing this. Pan-Africans demand this. As Professor Daniels already pointed out, we cannot afford to stand by and watch our sisters, African sisters and brothers, being massacred, being killed, being raped, being starved. As African people, we can't afford to do that. It would really, really expose us to the rest of the world as not caring about fellow African sisters and brothers. So that is why, again, on behalf of African diaspora and Pan-Africans, I urge our Ethiopian sisters and brothers, please come to the conclusion that the #1 priority today is an immediate ceasefire to be followed by peace negotiations. Regardless of who started this conflict, regardless of who has committed human rights abuses, these are the issues that can be investigated later on. But for today, as we speak, #1 issue must be an immediate ceasefire. And that is a message I urge Ethiopian sisters and brothers to accept today. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you very much, Brother Milton Allimadi, for your passionate appeal, which really situates the nature of what the conversations have been within the Pan-African Unity Dialogue. As we're being skewered, and we began to be skewered by people who saw us only as being biased, as being one-sided, and whatever. That is not our goal. That is not our objective. And we take seriously the prospect of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue playing a mediating role, a conflict resoluting role in this conflict. And I would just point out that there was an appeal made earlier by Pierre Sane that the forces that are advancing on Addis, TPLF, that they not invade, that they not go into Addis. Now, let me just say parenthetically and anecdotally, I'm not very bright. But if you have a popular regime, and I've heard this in the chat, representing millions and millions and millions of people, how is it that a force of Tigrayans, who the image I see of them, they're not RoboCops. The images I see are people who kind of like are, how is it that they can make those kind of advances? That should say something about what is going on anecdotally. I mean, not scientifically, but, you know, for the ideologues and the analysts, what does that say? That there is this threat being posed, but they should stop. As Pierre Sane should say, they've made the point. They have leverage now. They should stop. And again, one disaster or two wrongs don't make a right, as we've said before, in terms of outlining these issues. And so now it's about finding solutions. And the contours of that can be found, as Milton Allimadi said, in the dialogue that we have within the diaspora. And we certainly are willing to have that dialogue. Again, we've received messages, and I read a couple of them at least, and we may actually invite some folks to the next meeting of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue to engage in some of those conversations. They obviously represent the other point of view. They have a feeling that the Tigrayans are at fault, or that some of our spokespersons today are not credible and whatever. And we can perhaps talk about ways in which we can come together in that regard. But it is, the other thing I want to emphasize is something else that Milton Allimadi talked about, the power of the Ethiopian diaspora. It is so powerful that in a critical election in Virginia, which is a contest between the reactionary, retrograde, white nationalist forces of Donald Trump, I call him the Orange Man, Agent Orange, that was being played out in Virginia. That powerful lobby supported the candidate that's allied with the Orange Man. The data suggests that their vote was critical to actually electing the candidate that was allied with the Orange Man. Why? Because this conflict was such that the means justified, in their view, the end. Because the Biden administration was seen as being supportive of the Tigrayans, therefore we will support the MAGA minion mad people. That's insane. It's insanity. We don't need to do that as African people. We ought to be able to sit down and resolve our conflicts without moving to that point. So now what we want to do is we want to get to our questions and answers as soon as possible. I'm sure it will be vigorous, it will be animated, but we want to just quickly go to our panel, each for a quick one moment indication of what you see as being a solution. I think there's already been some discussion about that, but in order to provide more time for our questions and answers, because I'm sure there are going to be quite a few, we want to just quickly go in this order. We asked Don Rojas, followed by Dr. Nurhussein. Let's start quickly, Don Rojas, a minute in terms of your ideas on solution.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Daniels. I would like to see the African Union move forward with convening an emergency summit meeting of heads of state throughout the continent of Africa to begin to address the crisis in Ethiopia and come up with proposed solutions, African solutions for an African crisis. I think it is incumbent upon the African leaders in power today to address the issue of the crisis in Ethiopia. It is an issue that is grave enough to require the intervention and the authority, the moral authority to intervene in this at the level of the African Union. And I will also suggest that the CARICOM region also be asked to participate along with the African Union in seeking a peaceful and just end to the conflict. That would be my hope, my wish, my desire.
Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein. You're on mute, Dr. Nurhussein.
Okay. I would like to endorse Brother Don's idea, but unfortunately, the African Union has not proven itself capable of hosting that kind of forum. I hope the involvement of civil society, African civil society, both in the continent and in the diaspora, could really be the one that plays a role, as mentioned earlier by both Pierre, Sane, and Milton, and of course Dr. Daniels, because people should be the focus of this efforts and not the preservation of governments at any cost. And the African Union is not has not shown itself to be able to challenge a government in power. It always rallies behind a government. So there is a lot of civil society can play in this. I would concentrate on that.
Okay, thank you very kindly. Dr. Mulugeta, your quick thought.
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember that the African Union really disqualified itself in November when it aligned itself with the Ethiopian government, calling what is going on in Ethiopia as a law enforcement instead of really a civil war, and now actually a genocidal war. So I think that needs to be really underscored, underlined. The other thing is, I think I am optimist that there will be solutions that come from Africa generally, because we have a lot of statesmen, we have a lot of elders who can actually join in helping to solve this problem. Including former South African president Mbeki, or maybe Rwandan president Paul Kagame might probably join in to help Obasanjo. Obasanjo was yesterday in Mekelle meeting with the regional president Dr. Debretsion and his staff, and you can see pictures coming out. They are hand to hand talking about what is going on. So maybe there is a light way further in that tunnel. But here is very important thing.
Very important. Very quickly.
Quickly. This misnomer that the TDF marching to Addis Ababa. I mean, of course they are 200 miles away, and they should, because unless the siege stops, people in Tigray are going to die. I mean, that is the only and very important. The other thing is, like in 1991, the only force that can stabilize not only the country Ethiopia but also the region is actually this force. They have the capability, they have the experience, and they have the personnel to do that. So letting them stop, at the outskirts of Addis Ababa is not a good idea. Actually, let them go in like they did in 1991 and create a stable transitional government that includes everyone who is fighting for self-determination. Thank you so much.
Okay, Sister, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm saying Millete. I hope I'm not.
Millete, that's okay.
I'm sorry, I have to hear it. Millete, okay, now I got that part, okay.
Okay, thank you, Brother Ron. I didn't think you'd give me another chance. I know I rile people up, so thank you for giving me a chance.
Just a quick minute.
I'll be quick. I just want to say there are no two sides to rape. There are no two sides to forced starvation. There are no two sides to burning farmlands and looting and killing children and executing people and throwing them off of cliffs. There are no two sides to not giving people access to water and banking. And these are all of the things that are happening in Tigray. And so if we're true Pan-Africanists, let's speak up for the people. We can get to the politics. If you don't like the Constitution and the way that it's set up, have a constitutional convention. You can't bomb and kill your people. So I would say, as Pan-Africanists and everyone who's watching this, who I know care about Africa and the state of Africa and don't want to invite, more imperialism and that kind of thing, lift the siege. Advocate to lift the siege. That is an easy way to stop the fighting and to stop the violence. Otherwise, you're asking us to go back to Tigray and watch our children die. Go back to Tigray and watch your mother die. It's not fair. It's not realistic. The easy solution is just lift the siege, turn on the services. Then we can get to the hard work of what do we do now to fix our differences and come to a resolution.
You raise an interesting point, because what you have said, you have conceded that even though you're being skewered and you've been on the hot seat a great deal, you concede that those who are even opposing you care about Ethiopia. They care about the nation. And so the question becomes, very interesting point. A united front around lifting the siege, if in fact people see and believe that this kind of horrific carnage is taking place, it would seem that if we all care, maybe that is the starting point for the discussions, that we all care, therefore we lift, and then let's get to the table and then hammer out and iron out and have discussions about how we move forward. An interesting point that I just thought I would sort of put on the table. Now we go to Pierre Sane, your quick thought. You've certainly given us plenty of food for thought. Now just a little morsel as we move towards our Q&A. You're on mute. You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
4 quick points. Ethiopia is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so the International Criminal Court cannot investigate, but the Security Council can refer Ethiopia to the International Criminal Court so that all the crimes against humanity that have been committed in Tigray will be investigated, and all those responsible, be they in the Eritrean army or the federal army, will be taken to court. I mean, we have to stop in Africa. When a conflict is over, we reconcile without justice to the victims. So the first point I would insist is ask the Security Council to refer the conflict in Ethiopia to the International Criminal Court so that they can start investigation. The second point, I insist again, I think the IBW with the Black Caucus and with 1 or 2 moral leaders in Africa would be more effective than the African Union. The African Union is a syndicate of heads of states, and they protect each other. And I'm not sure it will be credible in the eyes of the population in Ethiopia. 3, I reiterate, I don't think, even if the TPLF is now apparently winning the war, I don't think they should enter Addis Ababa, because the people are armed, and the people in Addis Ababa will start killing each other. They will start detaining Tigrayan, and they will start killing each other. And when the army comes in, they come with revenge, etc. And it will be a disaster. And like my sister said, lift the siege. So those can be the points of agreement to start and then negotiate the ceasefire, and then have reflections coming together on how we solve this. And the way it is solved is going to be very important, because like I said, we can see the same tensions in other African countries. Right. African countries have now woke up to the Chinese model, so they want to duplicate the Chinese model. But the Chinese model is
we've heard that. Yeah, that was very extremely well laid out. I thought that was very instructive. Milton, a quick morsel, sir, before we get to our Q&A.
To be honest, I have nothing to add to what Brother Pierre Sane just said. The only thing I might add is that if we identify prominent individuals, eminent persons to be involved, I would also hope we have some prominent women involved.
Yes, absolutely.
And then ultimately, hopefully the UN would endorse this process, these prominent individuals, so that they have some auspices under which they're operating. That's the only thing I can add.
Okay, well, we want to now, Don Rojas, I guess, is going to be looking at the questions and sending them to me so I can put them to the panel. We're really beyond time, but we'll take 15 minutes for Q&A. That's not enough, but I think we're going to be extending this process. Inevitably, the Pan-African Unity Dialogue will be meeting in a couple of weeks or so, and we'll be looking at this question. I think it's been extraordinarily informative and helpful, and frankly appreciate even those who have come on to object and to feel that we were being biased and prejudiced and so forth. I have no prejudice in that regard. We accept the notion that people are fighting for the goodwill. People do believe that we need to have change and we need to figure out how to get this done. So in that regard, we certainly wanted to just to lay that out. So let's see, is there a first question, Don, that you're shooting to me in the chat, or how are we doing this? Or are you just going to pose the question? Don, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'll pose the question. There are, of course, lots of comments. Few questions, more comments than questions in the chat. I think there is one that you can address, Dr. Daniels, and it's the failure of the African Union so far to bring about a ceasefire. There are some who believe that the African Union is incapable of doing that, but we have called for the AU and the United Nations, in concert with the United Nations, to pursue a more robust solution. So do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think that Pierre Sane has talked about that. I think we should try to still shore up the African Union. I mean, I think that many of us are not pleased with the African Union in a lot of ways. First of all, it has not really followed through on its promised commitment to seriously engage the diaspora in a way that has been talked about as the sixth region. And yet it is a body that is a Pan-African body. So I think having conversation with them about our perspective would be helpful. But to the degree that their alignment with as Pierre Sane has said, with other leaders, or sort of each one protect each other, which really goes back to the conflict around the original OA Organization of African Unity, by the way. It was actually Haile Selassie who advocated for that kind of let's not interfere in each other's sort of internal affairs. Whereas Nkrumah was saying, no, we must be able to interfere to the degree that we see things that are not happening in a certain way. So I think we can open that dialogue with the African Unity, but at the end of the day, I think the proposal that has been put forth that we vigorously try to have some dialogue within the diaspora, that we engage the Congressional Black Caucus and other civil rights, human rights organizations in the diaspora to try to find a solution is one that we may well be equipped to do. And we do have allies in the Caribbean some of who are now on the Security Council. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I think, is still on the Security Council. Dr. Ralph Gonzalez has certainly been a great advocate for mediation and reconciliation, justice and reconciliation. And we use those terms advisedly, justice and reconciliation. So I think we have to explore it along those lines.
Dr. Daniels, if I were going to add, one thing to what you just said, it's really important that in this conversation, at the heart of the violence is now the siege. Unless the siege is removed, unless the siege stops, the path to negotiation, the path to any dialogue, it seems to be really difficult. So. Probably some of you may remember the Biafra siege of Nigeria, right? How did it stop? So if there are maybe some people here who can provide, from the panel, who can provide ideas on who to involve in kind of advocating for the stop of the siege. I mean, the Ethiopian diaspora is divided, like you see it on the
but
chat.
let's see, can we, I mean, that is an interesting point of departure. You know, I mean, at the human level, that is an interesting point of departure. I mean, I think there are other situations in which we would be not wanting to use food or health or the withholding as a weapon within a struggle. And so if we see our people suffering, I mean, can we at least not agree on that? And if we cannot agree on that, what does that say? It seems to me we need to be arguing that through. And so I think that Pierre Sane has laid out 4 points, one of which is the lifting of the siege. And I think, you know, there's kind of unanimity, at least within the Pan-African Unity Dialogue, that is a point of departure. John, is there a question? Is there a question that goes to one of the panelists? You know, in terms of,
I think this one can go to the panelists. It says that this is a comment that the people of Tigray are not Ethiopians, that they are a tribe somehow that exists outside of Ethiopia. Can that be clarified by our guest, please?
I would love to take that question. It's such a shame because there's a dehumanization effort around Tigrayans to say things like that we're not Ethiopian, or I've even heard wild things about other ethnic groups that they came from Madagascar and they're really, I mean, there's just all these crazy narratives about who Tigrayans are to exclude us from the story of Ethiopia, even though Tigray is at the heart of Ethiopia. You talked about El Najashi Mosque in Tigray. You talk about, you know, all of the things, the Battle of Adwa, the famous battles where colonialists were fought and beat back, all in Tigray. But the story is always, well, they're not real Ethiopians. Even in the comments here, people I respect, like Adama Baraka saying things like, this conversation should include Ethiopians, you know. Are we not Ethiopians? Are Tigrayans not Ethiopians? I mean, this is a very frustrating question. So when you talk about the integrity of the state doesn't even recognize us as Ethiopians. So if Tigray is somehow, secedes from Ethiopia, it's by force and by the state's hand, not by ours.
okay, anyone else would like to address that question?
Yeah, I think I will add actually to, you know, Millete has eloquently talked about that, but, you know, so if you just go to, you know, the origins of the Ethiopian state, you know, you cannot, you know, talk about Ethiopia without Aksum, you know. So, and Aksum is at the heart of Tigray. So if you talk about Christianity, you are going to always talk about Tigray. If you talk about, you know, Islam, you are going to talk about Tigray. So really, most of at the heart of the Ethiopian states, whether it's historical, whether it's linguistic, whether it is even literature-wise, the alphabet itself, the music itself, Saint Yared, they come from Tigray. So, you know, when we talk about Ethiopia removing Tigray from it, actually it becomes really hollow in a way. But for some people, Ethiopia is just land, it is territory, it is like the mountains. For me, Ethiopia is the people. And the people, it includes the people of Tigray. And to this day, the contribution of the people of Tigray, if you see to the Ethiopian state, whether it is in the military, whether it is in governance, has been really at the top. So I think it will be really blasphemy almost to say, you know, Tigrayans are not Ethiopians. We are, you know, maybe they are being made to feel that way, and that's why they are asking for a self-determination, for a referendum. But to me, as you know, as an American whose origins are from Ethiopia, I believe that you know, at the heart of the Ethiopian state has been what we call the Tigray region in every aspect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ron.
Okay, we're going to take one more question before we. Milton, if you end,
very quickly,
the end of it because we have to close. So you get the final.
No, very quickly. We won't take up even a minute. The purpose of the question also makes me wonder, what was the purpose of that question? Because if all human beings originated in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia and East and Central Africa, you know, what sense does a question like that even make, you know? That's my response.
Well, sisters and brothers, let me just say that this has been a vigorous conversation, and there's a lot going on in the chat. I do see some friends that I've known over the years going at it and having different perspectives, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with each other in relationship to this conversation. Let me be clear that the objective, as we said before, at the very beginning with the Pan-African Unity Dialogue, which is an effort to bring together, again, Continental Africans, Caribbean Americans, Afro-Latinos, and African Americans to, in fact, tackle difficult questions like this. And we have, and I am proud of the work that we've done. I think that every one of the speakers that we brought to the table speak from not only their heart, but they speak from a position of integrity. I don't see them as being propagandists or seeing them as being people who are simply tribalist or some of the characterizations that I've seen. I think there's an earnest interest in resolving the conflict. And indeed, the facts speak for themselves on the ground. A massacre of monumental proportions has taken place in a particular region. That is either true or not, and that it is true based on everything that we have seen. We have to deal with that reality. And based on that reality, begin to also deal with the politics. And there is a fundamental question here in terms of whether or not it is possible really to have a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious state where there is a unitary government, where there's a notion of a one unitary source, one identity that is kind of superimposed on top of that reality. Dear friend of mine, now beloved and now deceased Shashi McIntyre once said, Brother Ron, she said, we're all Black. But you have to understand that ethnicity is much stronger than our skin color. Ethnicity is important, and you can't just sort of paper over it. And on the African continent, including in Ethiopia, we have different ethnic groups. And so Pierre's Sane's proposition is profoundly important. Pan-Africanism is not a reality, it's an aspiration. It is an aspiration that some people say will never be accomplished, that we can create unity among our people, but it is not a bland unity either. It is a unity with a moral framework and a moral imperative that springs from the idea that we as an African people, though imperfect, can strive towards creating a paradigm of possibilities where African people can work together, build together to create a continent in its diversity, in its multiplicity of ethnic groups and cultures that can be the bright, shining beacon for the world. It's an aspiration. It may be impossible, but I think our challenge is to make the impossible probable. And so that is what we are attempting to talk about here in terms of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue. How do we reimagine? How do we engage in a conversation beyond what I would call a kind of bland, mechanistic, ideological, yeah, that's what I call it. I mean, we can have it out about that. There are realities. These systems do not work. We need to have systems with what I call inclusive governance. Let me say it again, inclusive governance. Governments of national inclusion that incorporate all of the ethnicities and the religions and into a system where everyone can share in the productivity of the nation and its resources. Not a system where you have on the top of it an elite that is, and we have to deal with that too. I mean, these African elites, most of which are self-aggrandizing, have no interest in the masses of the people anyhow. We're talking about the masses of the people. We're talking about what Du Bois called the richest continent on the face of the earth. I don't know what's going on with the Abiy regime, but certainly we find over and over again elites that are giving away the resources of Africa, giving away the resources. They are the agents of neocolonialism. They are the agents of imperialism because they're giving away the resources that should be feeding the people. And so we have to find again an African solution that's not bland, it's not like naive, but it's based on the idea that we have to have systems that are inclusive, that reconcile the need for a central ability to organize but also is sensitive to the multiplicity of interest. We ought to be able to do that. I mean, did we not give birth? Are we not Emotep people? Are we not the people who gave the world its first multi-genius? That's in our DNA. So I believe it's possible. I believe it's possible that we can do this. And so that's why we call this, that is our spirit, that is our aspiration as Pan-Africanists. And so we take seriously the charge to continue this conversation at our Pan-African Unity Dialogue meetings, to reach out to some of the people who have come to us and said it's biased, it's one way, it doesn't have we will reach out and try to include some of those voices. But we, at the end of the day, do want to deal with that fundamental proposition that our sister put on the table. Can't we all get along on the one proposition that can we not lift the siege? Can we not lift the embargo that is causing hundreds of thousands of our people to suffer? Can we not lift that siege? That is a moral question that in fact may couch what your real political beliefs are. And so, brothers and sisters, we thank you so much for joining us. We thank all of our panelists for indulging. And I must say also in closing that there were a number of women that we invited to be involved in the conversation, some of whom had other engagements. But I also must say that there was a degree of intimidation, a degree of, coming at people, almost verbally terrorizing people to the point that they just were unwilling to engage in the process. So we wanted to let people know why we did not have more women, because one of the fundamental things that we stand for in the Institute of the Black World 21st Century is gender equity. And so we will be, as we talk about moving forward around issues of justice and reconciliation, be seeking out to make sure that we have women voices in that process. So on behalf of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century and the Pan-African Unity Dialogue, we thank you, sisters and brothers, who have hung with us for this very important conversation. And we look forward to replaying it and engaging with you as we, in fact, seek pathways towards justice and reconciliation in Ethiopia. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for really the candid conversation.
Thank you. Looking forward to part 2.